reach out. So I'm actually going to give probably two talks today, because the first one's kind of short, but it'll whet your appetite. The first one's going to be sort of about the theoretical underpinnings and just sort of my visualization of what cognitive computing is all about, because people are always asking me, what is cognitive computing? How is it different from artificial intelligence? So I'm just going to try to give you sort of the way that I think about it. And this, of course, sort of underpins the technology that we have. And then we do what we call human capacity cognitive computing. And so I will explain in the second talk the second part of that, or the first part of that, the human capacity part of that, if we have time to get to it, but I think we will because we've got about an hour. Organizations have this thing called a digital transformation strategy. You've probably heard this. They're trying to move into the 21st century and do lots of cool things to exponentially speed things along. But most organizations have this supermassive black hole in the middle of their digital transformation strategy. There's all this stuff out here in the universe that you can see, and that's structured data that you can load into an Excel spreadsheet, and your data scientists can do their magic with it. But unfortunately, there's all this information that's in this black hole, and it can't get out of there. And there's a kind of big data Moore's law going on, where this supermassive black hole is getting bigger and bigger, and it can't come out because of this event horizon. The event horizon around a black hole is the place where light can't come out. Once it goes in, it's gone. So data that goes in there is hard to get back out. So just to talk a little bit about why this black hole is getting bigger and bigger. There's all this data that's pouring into the internet and into organizations right now, and it's in some unstructured format. So this graphic here I cribbed from somewhere. But I guess it was goglobe.com, give them credit. But I think it's from about 2013. And so, you can see here in 60 seconds, there's like 1,500 blog posts and 600 new YouTube videos and all this information that's happening on a minute-by-minute basis. And this being, 4 years ago now, it's probably all that's happening in 10 or 20 seconds now. So that's what we call sort of digital sprawl. This stuff is getting exponentially, bigger and bigger, and we've got more and more information that we can't really analyze. So Berkeley, across the river from us, they did a study in 2001 where they looked at, or they estimated all the data that was produced that year, and estimated that it was about 5 exabytes of data. Which they figured at the time was about the same amount of data that had been produced by humankind up until fairly recently. And then they did another study around 2011 where they found that at that point we were producing 5 exabytes every 2 days. So that's a pretty rapid expansion there. You can only imagine what it is now in 2017. We're probably producing that every 5 minutes or so. And with Internet of Things and the expansion of the internet into mobile phones and all of this, all of that is just expanding, even faster. So what do companies do with all this data? Well, they have a solution now, which is becoming kind of untenable. The approach of most companies is to add more capacity, which gives us all these like unwieldy data centers. They have to add more computers, more storage. Fortunately, storage is getting cheaper, but now they have to start worrying about what's the cost of the wattage that you have to store all this data in and to analyze it. That's a big issue for corporations. There's the cost of the data analytics staff, and even now, like all the data that corporations are bringing in is just too much data for data analysis staff to actually be able to analyze. So it's getting to the point where we need to do something else. Corporations need to figure out another solution. So when we come to problems like this, the way I think about it is I tend to look into nature and see if there's some similar problem that nature has come up with a solution to, because we've been evolving for millions of years. Nature's been around a long time, and nature usually figures out ways to solve these types of problems that we can learn something from. So in this case, I thought, where do we see a sort of big data problem where nature is taking care of it? One answer to that is just in the human brain, or any animal's brain, but particularly in humans. We've got about 100 billion neurons. We've got 15 billion of those are here in the cortex, and another 69 billion in the cerebellum. All those neurons make a whole lot of synapses. So the brain has its own sort of big data problem with lots of information coming into the brain. You've got sensory neurons. We tend to think of the senses, that there are 5 senses, but in fact there are 11 different types of neurons bringing information into the brain about things like touch, vibration, limb position, hot and cold, all that type of thing. All this information is coming through the spinal cord in 31 what they call spinal cord nerves, but these are actually bundles of thousands of nerves coming from all over your body. And these are firing at different rates, but the average is about 10 milliseconds for each nerve. So your brain just has a ton of information coming into it, every 10 milliseconds. So it's a lot of data to work with. Now, if your brain had a solution where it tried to store all this stuff in Hadoop, and run analyses on all that data, it would quickly become totally overwhelmed, and you wouldn't be able to deal with all the data that you have. So the brain itself has this big data problem. How does the brain approach this problem? What is the solution that it came up with? I might have pressed oh, there we go. Okay. So the answer is your brain doesn't actually store information. We think of I have a memory, and I see stuff and I remember it, and you think of your brain as like storing information, but it actually doesn't do that. What it does is it immediately processes that data, and then it takes that data and it will plot different types of data from different senses into a common representational space, okay? And it encodes it by compressing different types of information into meaningful chunks. Okay, so it's not storing the raw data, it's taking it in, plotting it into a common space as these sort of fused meaningful chunks. And then it stores only those meaningful chunks and uses those to make predictions, to make models about the world, to figure out, how to get back to the restaurant you were at last night, that type of thing. So I say it stores it in meaningful chunks, and a good question to ask there is what exactly do you mean by meaningful? So when I talk about compressed meaningful chunks of information, I'm saying the brain doesn't store raw data. Instead, you can think of Pavlov's dog, and I'm sure you're familiar with Pavlov and his sort of experiment he did here, which led to the whole theory of classical conditioning. So you've got Pavlov over here, and he would ring a bell, and then I guess food would come out of the thing, and the dog would salivate, and he had some kind of measuring thing to see if the dog was salivating or not, and the dog would eat the food. And over time, all Pavlov had to do was ring the bell, and the dog would start to salivate. And so he came up with the whole theory of classical conditioning, that in the dog's mind, the bell and the food had become sort of fused together into a stimulus response mechanism. So here's a case where you have one type of information, a sound, and another type of information, food coming, and these things get fused in the dog's brain into a single meaningful chunk. So it's a simplistic version of it, but it's exactly what I mean when I say that the brain takes in different types of information, fuses it, and stores only those meaningful chunks. So I'm going to make a bit of a radical proposition here, people wonder, what is the purpose of the brain? You're like, well, I have a brain so I can remember stuff. It stores information. We think of it as being like a hard drive or something. It also seems to be a kind of computer where it can actually plan and think about things and reason about what you're going to do tomorrow, all that stuff. My proposition to you is that the actual purpose of the brain is that it compresses information. It's a compression device, okay? Or a compression machine, if you will. So it's taking in all this information, and mostly what the brain is doing is compressing that information. And yes, it also stores it in a way that we actually don't know a whole lot about even now. But in the process of compressing that information, it also learned structure. And in learning that structure, it actually develops a model of the world and allows you to do all the things that you think about as thinking. So there's sort of a key tie here between compressing information and learning structure that if you've taken a lot of statistics, you are probably familiar with this. But if not, I'm just going to go through a simple kind of thought experiment with you anyway, so you understand how compressing information and learning structure are actually just the same thing, two sides of the same coin. So in this thought experiment, we've got the universe here, let's say 100 million light years to the east and west of the Earth, or whatever you call it in space. A cube, let's say. And we want to make a map. There we go. We want to make a map of our local part of the universe. So we get a big piece of paper, and it's 100 million light years across. And what we're going to do is we're going to take this three-dimensional universe, and we're going to plot the stars onto this piece of paper. Okay, so we draw a straight line from each star down onto the paper so we can make a map. So what we're actually doing here is we're compressing a three-dimensional structure, the universe, the stars, onto a two-dimensional map. So we're actually compressing information. Now, in case we ever want to rebuild the universe from this map that we're making, we want to draw this map in such a way that we can, if we try to reconstruct a three-dimensional universe from the two-dimensional one, we want to minimize the amount of error that we're going to make because we have to kind of randomly decide where they go in the three dimensions. So what we're going to do is when we're plotting these stars, we're going to plot them all, and then we're going to turn the piece of paper sort of randomly at first and try to find the place where all of so we have a distance here from the actual star to where we're plotting it on the piece of paper, and we're going to add up all of these distances, and when we turn our paper to the point where it's at the smallest sum of all these distances, we will have the least amount of error if we have to make the 3D universe again out of the 2D universe, okay? So we're doing compression by going from 3D down to 2D, and we're doing it in a way with a goal of trying to reduce the error as much as possible. Now, when we're doing this, when we get our two-dimensional view of the universe, we will actually have discovered something about the 3D universe. Does anyone want to take a guess at what we might discover? All right, I'll just give you the answer then. It's in the next slide, I think. Yeah, there we go. Whoops. So we will actually discover the galaxy. We'll discover the fact that the stars are not randomly distributed. There is structure to them. They form around a plane. And by doing this exercise that I just talked about, we will have magically aligned our piece of paper with the galaxy, because that will actually minimize our reconstructive error in going from 3D to 2D. So by compressing information and doing it in a way where you're trying to minimize your error in that compression, you actually discover structure, okay? So this is a simple example here of exactly what I think the brain is doing when it takes in all this information, compresses it, and by compressing it, also discovers information about the world. So just to sort of recap, our brain has this big data problem and it has a big data solution. First of all, it's a compression machine. It fuses information into meaningful chunks as it comes in, stores them in those meaningful chunks. In the process of compressing that information. It happens to learn structure that allows you to understand the world in the way that you do and to do all the neat things that your brain is able to do. And because of this, it is able to do what we call associative learning, where you're able to learn that things happen together. You can make a model to predict how the world's going to work. So from these fundamental principles, we now have a good basis to build a cognitive platform that takes these principles and can handle our own big data problems, not just on the kind of sensory information that the brain uses, but really any kind of information. So it's a platform based on human capacity, and I'll explain in the next talk a little bit more about what I mean by human capacity. Now I want to talk a little bit about, I mentioned earlier that the brain plots different types of information into a common representational space. So I want to explain for a minute what I mean by that. So you've got different types of sensory data coming in. You've got, let's say you're looking at your grandmother here, and the vision of your grandmother goes back here to the back of the brain, which for some reason is where your visual cortex is. So vision stuff gets represented there. You hear the word grandma, and that goes to the auditory cortex. And so there's some sort of pre-processing of audio going on here and some pre-processing of visual information going on here. But then that information gets sent on up to the cortex, and it all goes to the same place. So this is what I mean in the context of the brain about everything going to a common representational space. And there's good reason to believe that this is where this sort of fusing of meaningful chunks happens. So in the sort of machine learning world, and especially the world of deep learning, there have been a bunch of great experiments over the past few years that have done exactly this, where you have some kind of representational manifold, and you have language of things like dogs, cats, horse that are learned from whatever text source you're learning it from. And then you have a bunch of images, and the words for cat happen to get plotted in the same areas as an image for cat, and same for a horse and dog and car and all that stuff. So the way they do this is kind of similar to what I was just showing you in the brain. You've got an image comes in, that's processed by a convolutional neural net, which works well with images and can be thought of sort of as the visual cortex. You've got some kind of sentence coming in, like words like straw hat, and these are processed by a recursive neural network. And then all that stuff gets plotted into some common representational space where the image and the words are all plotted in one space together. And so this gives you that kind of fused semantic representation. Well, why would you want to do that? What can you do with that? Well, you can actually do some really cool stuff. And this is a paper from Fei-Fei Li's group at Stanford, where they processed a bunch of data in this way and produced a system that can now take a picture like this and say, okay, this is a plate of fruit, these are bananas, that's a fork. So all this text was actually generated by the computer that learned in the way that I was just showing you. And it can now take an image and just tell you what are all the things in that image. Really cool stuff that we couldn't do a few years ago and we never thought machines would be able to do. And now they just do it like it's nothing. So that paper is called Joint Visual Semantic Embedding, if you want to look it up. It's from 2015. So just to sort of sum it up, human capacity, cognitive computing, we take unstructured raw input from many different types of sensors. And these can be, not just language, not just vision, but, they could be weather sensors, they could be, IoT sensors, all kinds of things. Your house might have sensors on the doors and the lights and your, bathroom scale, all these things. So if you had some kind of cognitive computing appliance in your home, it could be taking all this stuff and processing it in the same way that we were talking about, doing with the other stuff we were just talking about. So could take all that, plot it into a common representational space, and then compress that information, fuse it into those meaningful chunks, store only the meaningful chunks, so we don't have to store the raw data because we don't really need the raw data. All we need is the representation of the world, whatever little world you're looking at. And then with the right compression process, one that tries to minimize the error of reproducing the world from the data that's coming in, you learn patterns and you're able to predict things in the world from those patterns. And then because it handles unstructured data in this way, we don't really need to develop, people are talking about with the Internet of Things, we're going to have to develop all these protocols, so your toaster can talk to your coffee machine and your refrigerator, and some engineers are going to have to sit down and work out all the things that all these devices are going to have to do and create a language for how they're going to talk to each other. But if we have a cognitive computing, say like home Internet of Things devices, those machines can just learn each other's languages the same way that people learn each other's languages. They can negotiate, the refrigerator can spend some time looking at what the coffee machine is doing and then say, oh, okay, I know what the coffee machine's doing. And your home cognitive computing appliance would actually be able to start, making predictions about, okay, the coffee machine turned on, so we should toast the toast now, that sort of thing. Don't even need to make any protocols. So we put the IEEE people out of business. So that's the end of this particular talk, and we're about 20 minutes in. If there are any questions about this particular one, we can talk about that, and then I'll move on to the one about the human capacity aspect.
So basically, do you think, if you agree that the brain, at least the compression machine part of the brain,
right,
it's more like an unsupervised.
Unsupervised, right.
And could we push something, our artificial system, more if you add up the supervised part? Because sometimes the brain is very constrained in the way it's able to process the information.
Oh, so you think we could make something that works faster if we did it in a supervised
do something
way?
More.
Yeah. I mean, that's true. The problem with a supervised approach is you're always introducing some bias by the labels that you're adding. You're adding some kind of assumption about how the world is by defining some set of labels and telling it to find only those labels. And maybe your labels miss a whole part of the distribution that is important in the world that you just didn't think of. So that's why if you can instrument your unsupervised machine to take in as many of the sensory information as is relevant to whatever your task is, you need more data and it takes more time, but you can usually get a more accurate representation of the world than you would if you try to do it in a supervised way. But that being said, I do think there are certain areas where if you really know, okay, we already know all of the things that influence this universe that I want to learn about, and you can provide it with accurate labels and an accurate you just want to learn the distribution of those labels. Of course, you can you could do that in a supervised way. Yeah, and unsupervised is always supervised in some way. It's supervised by taking in information about the world. So, but yeah, good question.